Don Marcello Valente thought he was the architect of a perfect empire. He thought his secrets were buried behind steel and blood. He was wrong. For 10 years, he treated his maid like a ghost, someone too invisible to notice the bodies he buried. Until the day he fired her, and realized she had the key to everything. He didn't just lose a maid. He lost his life. This is the story of how the woman who cleaned his floors, burned his world to the ground. Don Marcello Valente lived within a masterpiece of architectural arrogance, a sprawling, high-tech fortress of glass and steel perched precariously on the cliffs, overlooking a city that he considered his personal chessboard. To the world, he was the architect, a man who designed his criminal empire with the same clinical, obsessive symmetry as his home. Every morning, the sun would cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private study, casting long, sharp shadows over a desk carved from a single, massive block of obsidian. There was no dust here. There were no mistakes. In Marcello's world, a stray thread on a Persian rug or a smudge on a panoramic window was treated with the same lethal seriousness as a traitor in his ranks. He sat at the center of a digital web, monitoring 1,000 feeds that flickered across his monitors, security cameras, stock tickers, and offshore bank balances. His power wasn't just in his wealth, which was vast enough to buy the silence of whole zip codes, but in the absolute order he commanded. He moved through life with the cold, unhurried grace of a man who knew that every judge, every politician, and every police chief was a brick he had personally laid in the foundation of his fortress. To Marcello, he was more than a man, he was an institution, bulletproof, untouchable, and beyond the reach of consequence. Cora Hayes was the silent, invisible observer of this calculated perfection. As she moved through the vast, echoing hallways, her soft-soled shoes never making a sound, she was treated as little more than a ghost who polished the mirrors. Marcello would discuss million-dollar bribes and the cold-blooded disposal of rivals while she was standing mere feet away, buffing the silver or changing the linens. He never lowered his voice. He never paused. To him, Cora was as inanimate as the marble statues she dusted. He believed that someone of her station could never comprehend the complexities of his grand design, let alone find a flaw in its structure. This was the pinnacle of his reign, a moment of total, arrogant security. His empire was profitable, his enemies were silent, and his fortress seemed impenetrable. He had spent decades ensuring that no one could ever get close enough to strike at his heart, fortifying his life with layers of technology and terror. He had forgotten that the strongest structures often crumble not from a massive blow to the outside, but from a single, overlooked crack within the very walls built to keep the world away. He was the architect of an empire that seemed destined to last forever, never realizing that the woman quietly cleaning his floors was the only person who knew exactly where the foundation was hollow. Cora had a gift for invisibility that was more than just a byproduct of her job, it was a weapon she had honed over a decade of silence. To the guests who cycled through the Valente estate, men with heavy brows, tailored suits, and eyes that never quite settled, she was merely a component of the expensive background, no more significant than the antique vases or the obsidian desk. She moved with a rhythmic, practiced hush, her presence masked by the low hum of the vacuum or the delicate clinking of crystal glasses being polished to a mirror shine. While she buffed the heavy brass handles of the study doors, she heard the names of companies being dismantled and the quiet, terrible instructions for lives to be signed away. She didn't just clean the house, she curated its darkest secrets. Marcello would sit at the center of his glass fortress, gesturing with a hand that bore a ring worth more than Cora's hometown, detailing the precise coordinates of a delivery in the harbor while she was inches away, emptying his gold-rimmed wastebasket. He never broke his stride. He never lowered his voice. To him, Cora didn't have ears, she didn't have a memory. He assumed her mind was occupied with grocery lists and laundry detergents, never imagining that she was mentally mapping the geography of his corruption. She saw the dark, iron-scented stains on the ivory rugs that wouldn't come out with lemon juice and salt, stains that told the silent history of a struggle his security team had failed to fully scrub away. She became a living archive of his arrogance. Every time he spoke about a bribe over his morning espresso, or laughed about a silenced witness while she ironed his silk shirts, a new layer was added to her quiet understanding. Cora didn't have an empire, but she had something Marcello lacked: perspective. She knew which floorboards creaked under the weight of a secret and which safes were left unlocked when he was distracted by the sheer scale of his own reflection. She was the ghost in the machine, a woman who had spent 10 years learning the rhythm of his breathing and the patterns of his lies. She was patient, waiting for nothing in particular, simply existing in the deep shadows cast by a man who believed the light belonged only to him. She knew the architect's secrets weren't buried behind steel, they were scattered in plain sight, waiting for the one person he considered nobody to finally decide to look. The silence of the mansion was broken not by a scream, but by the cold, metallic snap of an empty jewelry box. Marcello Valente stood in his dressing room, staring at the velvet indentation where his custom, $500,000 diamond-encrusted watch should have been. To anyone else, it was a piece of jewelry. To Marcello, it was a symbol of his absolute precision, and its absence was an insult he could not tolerate. He didn't check the drawers. He didn't look under the bed or scan his memory for where he might have left it. A man like the architect didn't lose things, things were taken from him. Cora, his voice thundered, a low-frequency growl that seemed to vibrate through the very vents of the house. When Cora entered the study moments later, she found him standing behind his obsidian desk, his face a mask of pale, controlled fury. He didn't ask her if she had seen it. He didn't ask if it had been moved for cleaning or sent for maintenance. He simply leaned forward, his knuckles widening as he pressed them against the polished stone. "Where is it?" he whispered, the quietness of his voice more terrifying than the shout that had preceded it. Cora felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her chest, but she held her ground. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Valente," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic hammer of her heart against her ribs. Marcello let out a short, dry laugh, a sound entirely devoid of humor. 10 years, he mused, looking at her not as a human being, but as a smudge of dirt he had just noticed on a masterpiece. 10 years I let you crawl around this house. I fed you. I gave you a roof. And you think you can just reach out and take a piece of my life? You think your tiny, insignificant hands can touch what belongs to me? I didn't take anything, Cora said, her eyes meeting his. She had spent a decade anticipating his needs and maintaining his sanctuary, and the sheer speed of his betrayal felt like a physical blow. His hand slammed against the desk, a sound like a gunshot in the sterile room. You are a thief. A roach who thought she could hide in the shadows of my success. He began to pace, his words dripping with a venom that went far beyond the missing watch. He called her names that stripped away her humanity, reducing a decade of loyal service to a parasitic act. He didn't see the woman who had meticulously cared for his estate or the person who knew his every habit. He saw a convenient target for his mounting rage. He accused her of planning it for months, of laughing at his perceived weakness behind his back. The watch was irrelevant now, he was intoxicated by the act of crushing her. He wanted her to feel as small as he had always believed she was, never realizing that in his blind, arrogant fury, he was accusing the only person who actually knew where his real treasures were buried. The architect's mercy was a myth, and Cora was about to experience the full, jagged weight of his cruelty. Marcello didn't just want her gone, he wanted her erased from his existence as if she were a spill on a marble floor. With a sharp, flicking motion of his hand, the same detached gesture he used to order the demolition of a building, 2 of his largest security guards appeared in the doorway of the study. They didn't treat her like a woman who had spent 10 years maintaining the sanctuary of their home, they treated her like a piece of refuse that had finally begun to smell. They grabbed her by the upper arms, the grip of their gloved hands bruising her skin, and began to drag her toward the service entrance. My things, Cora managed to gasp, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and burgeoning cold. My final pay. I've worked 3 weeks without a single day off. Marcello stood at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase, looking down at her with a chilling, detached satisfaction that made him look like a gargoyle carved from ice. You're lucky I don't have you buried in the foundation of my next project, he spat, his voice echoing off the sterile marble walls. Consider your life your final payment. Now get this thief out of my sight before I change my mind. The heavy iron service door swung open, and they shoved her out into the night. The sky had turned a bruised, angry purple, and the rain was no longer a drizzle. It was a violent deluge that soaked through her thin uniform in seconds. Cora stumbled, her knees hitting the wet, jagged gravel of the long, winding driveway. One of the guards threw a single, black trash bag after her, the sum total of her 10 years of service. It split open upon impact, spilling her modest belongings into the cold mud. Her spare uniform, a few photographs of her mother, and a worn Bible were instantly muddied and saturated by the freezing downpour. As the massive, ornate iron gates of the Valente estate groaned shut with a final, definitive clang, Cora stood alone in the storm. The lights of the mansion glowed warmly behind her, a golden fortress that had just discarded its most faithful servant like a broken tool. Marcello watched from the height of his window, sipping a glass of vintage wine, satisfied that he had finally cleaned house. He believed that by removing the maid, he had removed the only witness to his rot. He stood there in his warm, dry world, never imagining that the woman shivering in the mud was holding something far more dangerous than a diamond watch. The rain washed the dirt from Cora's face, but it couldn't wash away the cold, hard resolve settling in her chest. She looked up at the fortress one last time, her eyes burning with a light that had nothing to do with the lightning overhead. Marcello thought he had thrown her away to save his empire, but he had no idea he had just handed the match to the woman who knew exactly where he kept the gasoline. The chill of the storm followed Cora into her cramped apartment, a space that could have fit into Marcello's dressing room 10 times over. She didn't reach for a towel or a change of clothes. She stood in the center of her kitchen, water pooling on the cracked linoleum, and reached into the secret, waterproof lining she had sewn into her old Bible months ago. Her fingers, numb and trembling, closed around a small, silver USB drive, the master key she had discovered while deep cleaning the hollowed-out base of a marble bust in Marcello's private study. She had found it 6 months ago, hidden in a cavity Marcello likely thought was too dusty for any hand but his own. At first, she had considered it a discarded relic of his high-tech obsession, but as she polished the obsidian desk and listened to the architect brag about his invisible maneuvers, she realized it was his ultimate insurance policy, a dead man's switch containing the digitized blueprints of his entire underworld. She had kept it hidden, bound by a misplaced sense of loyalty and a paralyzing fear of the man she served. But as she sat at her small, flickering laptop, the humiliation of being called a roach burned hotter than the freezing cold in her bones. The screen flickered to life, illuminating her wet face in a cold, blue glow. Folder after folder appeared, labeled with the same clinical precision Marcello used to manage his estate, the architect's graveyard. Inside were GPS coordinates for every disappearance Marcello had ordered over 2 decades, sites where the concrete footings of his grand building served as headstones for his rivals. There were high-definition recordings of Supreme Court judges accepting briefcases of cash and transcripts of encrypted calls linking the city's elite to the architect's payroll. It was more than just evidence, it was the structural integrity of his entire world, laid bare in lines of code and audio files. Marcello had fired her because he thought she was too small to notice the diamonds on his wrist, never realizing that while he was busy admiring the jewels, she had been studying the foundation of his soul. He had treated her like a ghost, forgetting that ghosts see through walls and leave nothing behind but the haunting truth. Cora stared at a file containing the names of the families Marcello had destroyed to build his glass fortress, and for the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel like a maid. She felt like an avalanche. The watch Marcello lost was a trinket, the drive Cora held was a detonator. For 48 hours, Marcello Valente savored the clinical silence of his mansion. He had replaced Cora with a nameless cleaning agency, workers who didn't look him in the eye and, more importantly, didn't linger in his study. He felt lighter, convinced that his clean house policy had finally purged the last of his vulnerabilities. He spent his morning in the obsidian study, pouring a glass of vintage scotch and watching the city skyline, believing himself to be the undisputed god of all he surveyed. But as the ice settled in his glass, the first hairline fracture appeared in his perfect foundation. It started with a frantic, stuttering phone call from his private banker in Zurich. A massive holding account, a ghost fund that didn't officially exist on any ledger, had been flagged and frozen by an international task force. Marcello dismissed it as a technical glitch, a minor tremor in a system he had spent decades making earthquake-proof. But by noon, the tremors had become a full-scale collapse. His encrypted laptop began to scream with notifications. His invisible construction sites, the very projects used to wash his millions, were suddenly swarmed by federal inspectors. They weren't checking for fire exits, they were carrying ground-penetrating radar and heading straight for the concrete footings where the bodies were buried. The panic he had so often enjoyed inflicting on others now mirrored in his own reflection. The architect's graveyard was no longer a secret file, it was a front-page headline. Marcello watched the live feed from his security monitors as his digital web was shredded by an invisible hand. One by one, his most loyal bricks, the judges he had bought and the politicians he had groomed, began to vanish, resigning in disgrace or turning state's evidence before the first subpoena could even be served. He sat in the deepening shadows of his glass fortress, realizing that every security measure he had installed and every secret he had buried was being exposed with the precision of a master surgeon. He looked at the empty spot on his wrist where his diamond watch used to be and felt a sickening jolt of clarity. He had been so obsessed with a missing trinket that he had ignored the fact that his entire blueprint had been stolen. The architect was no longer building, he was watching his life's work dissolve into a heap of rubble. The storm he had so cruelly thrown Cora into was no longer outside his gates, it had breached the walls, and for the first time in his life, Marcello Valente was the one left shivering in the dark. Cora knew that taking the drive to the local precinct would be equivalent to hand-delivering her own death warrant. In a city where Marcello Valente owned the badges, the gavels, and the very air the commissioners breathed, she needed a different kind of power, one that didn't answer to a paycheck or a threat. She needed Sarah Jenkins, an investigative reporter known as the Vulture. Sarah lived in a world of coffee-stained notebooks and burner phones, far removed from the gold-plated decadence of the Valente estate, and she was the only person in the city Marcello hadn't been able to buy, mostly because she preferred the truth to a comfortable life. When the two women met in a crowded, noisy diner on the edge of town, Cora didn't waste time with pleasantries. She didn't tell Sarah about the years of invisible service or the bruising grip of the guards. She simply pushed a small, padded envelope across the Formica table. Inside was the silver USB drive and a handwritten note with a single name, the architect. Sarah, used to cranks and conspiracy theorists, opened her laptop with a sigh of practiced skepticism. But as the files began to load, as the GPS coordinates mapped out missing persons cases dating back to the 90s, and the high-definition audio of Marcello Valente filled her headphones bragging about a fixed Supreme Court seat, the color drained from her face. "Where did you get this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with the realization that she was holding the story that would burn the city's power structure to the ground. Cora leaned back, her face a mask of calm, though her heart still raced with the memory of the rain. "I was just the help," she said quietly. "But the help hears everything. I watched him build that house of cards for 10 years. Now, I want to watch you knock it down." Within hours, Sarah didn't just write a story, she ignited a firestorm that the architect couldn't extinguish. She leaked the first few files to major international news outlets, bypassing the local stations Marcello controlled through shell companies. By nightfall, the architect's graveyard was the top trending topic globally. The evidence was too precise, too documented, and too horrific to be ignored. The public outcry was so massive that the corrupt officials Marcello had in his pocket were forced to make a choice: protect their benefactor or save their own skins. One by one, they chose themselves. The phone in Marcello's study didn't ring with warnings anymore, it remained ominously silent. The man who thought he controlled the narrative was now being written out of history by a journalist he had never met and a woman he had treated like a ghost. Marcello had designed his empire to withstand an army, but he had never prepared for a single, well-placed call from the woman who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The end did not arrive with a quiet settlement or a secret deal in a shadowed room, it arrived with the deafening, synchronized roar of a fleet of black SUVs tearing up the gravel driveway of the Valente estate. The glass fortress, once the undisputed symbol of Marcello's untouchable power, was suddenly illuminated by the violent, rhythmic strobing of red and blue police lights that reflected off every clinical surface. For the first time in 20 years, the massive iron gates didn't swing open for a distinguished guest. They were rammed off their hinges, groaning in protest as the perimeter was breached. Inside the obsidian study, the silence of the house was replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots on marble. Marcello stood paralyzed in the center of the room, watching through his floor-to-ceiling windows as federal agents swarmed his grounds like a fever breaking. He reached for his encrypted phone to call the chief of police, but the line was a hollow drone. He reached for his panic button, but the system had been bypassed by the very encryption codes Cora had pulled from his drive. The architect was trapped in a blueprint of his own making, and the walls were finally closing in. Across the city, the montage of his downfall played out in real time. On the monitors he had once used to survey his kingdom, he now watched his most trusted associates, men who had sworn blood oaths of silence, being led away in handcuffs. The senator who had shared his finest cigars was shown being hustled into a squad car with a jacket over his head. The judges who had dined at his table were being stripped of their robes. It was a systematic dismantling, a surgical removal of every brick Marcello had ever laid. The invisible deals were now lead stories on every network, and the graveyard he had kept hidden was being excavated by teams of forensic specialists under the glare of news helicopters. The door to the study burst open, but Marcello didn't flinch. He stood with his back to the room, looking at his own hollow reflection in the glass, a man stripped of his crown. As the lead agent stepped forward to read him his rights, a handheld tablet was placed on the desk in front of him. It showed a live feed from outside the precinct. There, standing on the edge of the sidewalk, was Cora. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't celebrating. She was simply standing there, calm and resolute in the fading light, watching the world witness the truth she had carried. The handcuffs clicked shut, a cold, final sound that signaled the total collapse of his house of cards. As they led him out of the mansion, Marcello looked down at the ivory rug he had once accused Cora of staining. He realized then, with a sickening, final clarity, that the only stain he should have worried about was the one he had left on the soul of the woman he had treated like a ghost. His billion-dollar empire had been brought to its knees not by a rival Don or a complex government sting, but by the meticulous memory of a simple maid who had finally decided that the house was clean enough. 6 months after the fall of the Valente Empire, the mansion on the cliff stood as a hollow monument to a dead era, its windows dark and its obsidian desk gathering the very dust Marcello had spent a lifetime fighting. Marcello himself was no longer the architect of a city, he was inmate 4052. Confined to a 6-by-9-foot concrete cell where the only thing he had to organize were the minutes of a life sentence that stretched into infinity. The tailored silk suits had been replaced by coarse, institutional gray, and the power that once moved markets couldn't even buy him an extra hour of sunlight. His name was no longer a word that opened doors, it was a cautionary tale in a legal textbook, a reminder that a house is only as strong as the respect you show the people who keep it standing. Cora Hayes did not return to the mansion. She didn't want the ghosts, the gold-plated faucets, or the blood-stained ivory rugs. Instead, she used her reward money to become a different kind of architect, opening a center dedicated to rebuilding the lives Marcello had systematically dismantled. She lived quietly, her invisibility now a choice rather than a condition imposed by an arrogant man. She had traded her white apron for a legacy of justice, proving that the smallest person in the room is often the one holding the heaviest truth. She had learned that while Marcello could buy silence, he could never buy the loyalty he had so carelessly discarded in the rain. The story of the architect remains a chilling lesson for the powerful. You can build walls as high as the sky and gates as thick as mountains, but you can never truly lock out the truth. The people you treat like ghosts are the ones who eventually learn how to walk through walls. Marcello lost his world because he thought he was too big to fail and Cora was too small to matter. He learned, too late, that money can build a fortress, but only respect can keep the foundation from crumbling. Don Marcello thought Cora was too small to matter, but she ended up being the only person big enough to bring him down. This leaves us with one question: if you were Cora, would you have waited 10 years to gather that evidence, or would you have walked away the moment you saw the truth? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. While you're down there, Smash that subscribe button and hit the bell so you never miss another deep dive into these incredible stories of power and revenge. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.